Anyone had the blessed opportunity of serving the undeserving? Any waitresses or waiters, table servers, ever had an obnoxious, ungrateful customer, and you're like, man, do I have to go and keep serving this person? Any nurses or physician's assistants or doctors or anybody in the health field ever have a patient who's undeserving, to put it kindly? Kind of hard to administer loving care to them. Any parent or grandparent in the house ever fixed a meal for an undeserving child? Yeah? Right? Sometimes, yeah, I'm not going to give you what you deserve because you wouldn't live, right? I mean, we've probably all had the experience of serving the undeserving. And so we all know what it's like to deal with a person who has a selfish attitude, a self-centered attitude. And when we're in this chapter 26 of the story, the darkest hour of Jesus, we wouldn't expect to find that attitude among the disciples in the upper room, the night before Jesus' crucifixion, his darkest hour. And they're arguing among themselves in that upper room about who's the greatest. And neither of them are washing each other's feet, which was not only a sign of hospitality when you went into a home, but was also a ritual. It was showing humility before another. It was loving another person, especially during the Passover feast. And it seems like this is the third argument that the followers of Jesus have had about this issue of who is the greatest, even though Jesus has confronted their self-centered, selfish attitude. And one time Jesus says, recorded in Mark, "Whoever wants to be first among you must be the slave of everyone else. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and to give his life as a ransom for many." You want to be the greatest? Serve like a slave. For even the Son of Man, the Creator of everything, has come to serve and to give his life for others. This verse really captures chapter 26 of Jesus' darkest hour. And though he had taught this many times, his disciples had failed to get it. Now let's advance 2,000 years to now, to present, right? Our attitude isn't much different when we first come to Jesus. It really is about what we would like. You know, if you went to the website, happywithjesus.com, and you took our church survey, which measures if you're happy with the parking lot experience, you're happy with the greeting experience. Some of you are getting out your phones maybe right now and going, happywithjesus.com. It doesn't exist. I double-checked even last night that website does not exist, and this survey does not exist. We live in a world that's driven by consumerism. And we're often, coddled when we go into a business because they should. I mean, their job is to, meet whatever desires we have, and they have surveys about if we're satisfied with their service, right, and all about that. But when we come to church, we're not consumers, we're servers. Actually, when we're in the church and out of the church, we're to have a servant mentality because we're followers of Jesus. But oftentimes we come into church with a consumer mentality. And we start measuring things by if it satisfies us. And we're stop measuring things if it's really pleasing to Jesus. I know some of you might not like this. It's one of those "aren't you glad you came" statements. But Cornerstone is not here to make consumers. We're here to make disciples. And disciples serve like Jesus serves. And that's a big calling. And it's a little bit daunting when you think about it in your everyday life. And so it's amazing, though, when Christians will do this, it changes lives. It's newsworthy. It's the kind of thing we love to talk about. We love to talk about how this person served this undeserving person, and when it happens, it's amazing. This past weekend, I had the opportunity to do a retreat in Richmond with a Waypoint. Now, some of you don't know what Waypoint is. It's a church planting organization, and so we're planting churches throughout Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Maryland, West Virginia, D.C. Beltway area. And there was a guy there that just told an amazing story. His name is Michael Bartlett. And he's a church planter. They planted this church in 2017 in Frederick, Maryland, a place that didn't have a church in a very populated area. And so he went up there and he told his story. Here's a picture of Michael. And this is, they've just moved into they're just moving into a facility that they're going to be permanent in. They've been meeting in a school, so if you know anything about what it's like to meet in a school or a movie theater as a church, some of you might have had that experience, right? There's got to be a setup crew, and they come in at 6 a.m., and then there's a tear down crew, and they leave at 3 a.m., 3 in the afternoon, sorry. And so, like they've been going through this week after week, and Michael told his story, and I was really touched by it, and I just want to share a little bit with you about it because it's all about, are you hearing me? Are you cluing in? Listen up. It's all about when someone serves someone undeserving. The kingdom grows and life changes. So, Michael, he was part of he attended the very first Waypoint church plant 25 years ago. In Chantilly, Virginia, the Journey Church. And he didn't grow up in church. His parents didn't go to church. But they had this service for the undeserving. They set up blow-up houses and gave hot dogs and had music and games for people in the community. And his parents didn't have much money. His dad was a blue-collar guy, hard worker, but wasn't making enough to cover all the debt, right? And so he said, hey, there's free food. Let's take the kids down there. And they did. And the kids had a great time, except Michael was in the bounce house. He's a little guy, and he banged his head with another guy who was trying to be Buzz Lightyear, right? Remember? Buzz Lightyear, love that guy. And he got a bloody head, and they had to rush him to the emergency ER to stitch up his head. And Michael says, I never forget, as we were pulling out of the parking lot, this church, they did this thing for us, and the youth minister's saying, we have insurance, we'll pay for it, right? It's always a fear when churches put on events like that, Well, anyway, on the way home, Michael's mother turns around and says, would you guys like to go to church Sunday? And he goes, I was floored. No one had ever asked me that question. No one had ever invited me to church. No one had ever invited my parents to church. But these people did, and we came back and got to just, loving Jesus. And my parents accepted the Lord, and I accepted the Lord, and when it came time to go to college, I just said, well, I want to go where there's a bunch of Christians. So he went to Milligan College in East Tennessee. And while he was there, first weekend, he wants to go to church, right? So he drives down Johnson Highway, Milligan College right there, in Milligan Highway, and goes into Johnson City and goes into church. And he didn't understand what was going on. This Christian church, they were singing out of Bibles. He thought they were singing out of Bibles, but it was hymnals. He never saw a hymnal. Never heard a hymn song, ever. And he went back, and he sat in his dorm room, and he sat across from his dorm mate, and he says, my parents would never go to that church. I think God's calling me to start a church that my parents would go to. And so that's what he did. And in 2017, they launched this church called Collective. They've baptized 275 people in 2 years. One of the fastest growing churches in the Waypoint movement. But my point is this. That church is leading literally hundreds of people to Jesus because one church served the undeserving. If you're going to be part of this family, you're going to be coached and exhorted and maybe even guilted every once in a while to serve. We need people on Wednesday night when they get out their children's lesson to go over that, and they're getting ready for Sunday, man. We need people to show up here on time and be ready to greet people. We need people to put communion trays together. It's difficult sometimes serving undeserving people. You don't know these people. The kids may be, knuckleheads, as kids often are. But because we serve the undeserving, lives are changed, kingdom grows. When you serve somebody deserving, you honor them, and that's good. You should do that. But when you serve the undeserving, you honor Christ. And your reward's in heaven. There's a bunch of girls that have gotten together to minister to other girls called Mod Fem. And those girls are going to stay in, the women that go down there, they're going to be staying in cabins. It's going to be cold. It'll probably snow that weekend. Just saying, like we hadn't had any snow. It'll be in May, right? Something like that, right? So anyway, it's a cost to do that. But that's what this is all about. Jesus in the upper room walks in. The disciples are arguing about who's the greatest. And a slave shows up. His name is Jesus. So he got up from the table. He took off his robe. He wrapped it around a towel around his waist. And he poured water in the basin. And then he began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel he had around him. He tied it in the manner of a Greek slave. So the outer tunic, took it, stretched it out, put it around his waist, and tied it in 3 knots. Might have been 2, I don't know, several knots, denoting a slave. And then with the unknotted end, he would wash and then dry the feet of the disciples. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the Son of Man washing your feet? The nature of foot washing in the Jewish eyes was to be done by a slave. It was to be done by someone who was beneath them. And Jesus is a slave to all. It was reserved for Gentiles or wives or children or, as we said, slaves. And so Jesus, he took this position with them. After washing their feet, he put on his robe again and he sat down and he asked, "Do you understand what I was doing? You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right. Because that's what I am. And since I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash others' feet. I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done to you." And I tell you the truth, slaves are not greater than their master, nor is the message more important than the one who sends the message. Now that you know these things, God will bless you for doing them. If you want to receive the Lord's blessings, become a slave and servant to undeserving people. Woo! Aren't you glad you came? You could have missed this message and your life would have been much easier. But now that you heard it, you're accountable to it. Jesus has given us this example, and blessings flow from it. But to be honest, I serve others when I know it will benefit me. I'm trying to move into their peer group, their social circle, so I'll take their plate, or I'll get their drink, or get them coffee, or because I know if I'm nice to them, they'll be nice to me, and that's what I want. So oftentimes my motives, I'm just talking about me, I don't know about you. I'm talking about me. I'm just saying sometimes my motives are about really serving me and not really about serving them. And that's not what Jesus is talking about. And so it really gets difficult to try and serve someone who's totally undeserving of your efforts. How do you serve an undeserving husband who's distant and cold and uncaring? How do you serve a harsh wife whose words are always cutting and critical and judgmental? How do you serve an undeserving teenager who's deceitful and rebellious? How do you serve an undeserving parent who's called you several names that you won't tell your friends, super critical, and all they do is fault find. Like, how do you serve as a child that parent? How do you serve a backstabbing coworker? How do you serve a school bully? How do you serve a best friend that's betrayed you? How do you serve a spouse that's abandoned your family? How do you serve an estranged husband who's missed child support from the very beginning? How do you serve the undeserving? Who among you is the greatest? Just the mailman. Just the mailman, right? Here's how you do it. You train yourself to serve the undeserving. You don't try, you train. Remember, we talked about this many times. We don't try to be like Jesus. We train to be like Jesus. So, start serving small and work your way up to the big leagues. So, you could start by preparing communion trays. We don't have anybody for next month. Anybody want to sign up? Okay, we got one. All right. Oh, you got them? Okay. Well, look. All right. So we need some people to work in children's ministry. Elders, guard the doors until all spots are filled. Hey, I'm being totally serious. If you want to move this message of Jesus to application, start serving the local church. I already told you a story about Michael Bartlett. Don't you want to see that happen? I do. I really do. Start serving by getting ready for Kingdom Kids. Start serving by being one of our greeters. Show up here at 8:45, pray with us, and be ready. You know, when you're bringing your guest, your friend, your extended family member who hasn't been to church for a very long time, you're hoping, you're praying as you bring them in like everything's right. Like the greeters are smiling, the coffee's good, the preacher won't go too long. Like you're hoping about all of that. 2 out of 3 ain't bad. So anyway, we have some shut-ins that need meals taken to them. Could you prepare an extra meal one week or set some aside from one of your meals, and I'll give you an address. You can literally take it to their house. Start small and work your way up to the big leagues. Train yourself to be like Jesus. And see, here's what happens, because here's what's happened in my life. As I learned and put this into practice, it became, I won't say easier, but more attainable to serve people who are undeserving when I began to learn how to do it at church. It's really that simple. Now, for some of you, you already see yourself undeserving. Like maybe too much undeserving. You see yourself like Peter, like really struggling to let Jesus wash your feet. You see, the other side of grace, the other coin of grace is receiving grace. Sometimes the most gracious thing you can do is to receive God's grace. Because in your mind, somehow, some way, that sin you committed, that screen that you were looking at last night, those words you said to your spouse, that thing you didn't do, you should have done, that lie you told, somehow you've said to yourself, if I just keep beating myself up, if I just keep telling myself I'm a loser, I'm a failure, I'll never get it right, if I just keep telling myself that I'm never going to be better and good enough, God will somehow forgive me because I will martyr myself before Him. And is anybody here? You tracking? Come on. And so sometimes the biggest thing to do is just to receive God's grace. If Jesus was here, if Jesus, He is here. I've asked Him to be here and others have too, so Jesus is here. He is here. But if He was here in the flesh, could He wash your feet? Huh? It's a struggle to receive God's grace. Look, we're coming to this time of communion. Part 1 of this sermon. And in a moment, the team's going to come up, or they're coming up right now, okay? And we've got some guys that are going to go to the stations. And during this next song, you're going to have an opportunity to come and take communion. You're going to take it at the station. And the men will serve you, and you'll leave your cups there. But before we come to that moment, I want to tell you just a real quick story. There was this young woman. She came to church, traditional church, and she sat down. She had to sit like in the second row because all the regular people sat at the back. Because they thought the back seats were them because they're the stakeholder members. So I'm sitting in the back. They didn't think about like how important it is to let those who are just struggling to find God sit at the back. Move up and move in so people can come in is the way I say it. Anyway, the elder, big, burly guy, he brings the tray to this woman, and she's sobbing. He doesn't know what's wrong. He just says, "Take it." And she says, "No." And he knew what was going on. She felt undeserving. And he says to her again, "Take it, girl. It's for you." After that moment in the upper room, Jesus and his disciples head to the Mount of Olives. It was during the Passover celebration that week where animals are slaughtered all week long. And you see, there were so many animals that were slaughtered during those big festivals that they had a way to wash out the temple of the Gentiles where a lot of these animals were carved up. And they had these viaducts of water that would bring water in, and they would basically brush the floor, and then out the other side, these small holes at the bottom of the wall, the blood and the water would flow down into the Kidron Valley. It was a little creek, but during those big celebrations, it was more than a creek. It was a stream of blood and water. Jesus walks out of the upper room, and they cross that river of blood and water. And they go up to the garden, one of his favorite places. I wonder what was going on in Jesus' mind as they waded through the blood and the water. They go up to the place where Jesus liked to pray, the Garden of Gethsemane, this olive garden, this place where they were familiar with. It was a place where Jesus found some comfort. And Jesus went into the olive grove and called Gethsemane, and he said, "Sit here while I go over there to pray." And he took Peter and Zebedee's two sons, James and John, and he became anguished and distressed, and he told them, "My soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. Stay here and watch with me." He's the Son of Man. He's all God. He's all man. He's distressed. He's anxious. He's overwhelmed with all types of emotion of being sorrow and upset and just this epic battle between the flesh and the spirit. Is anybody tracking? You ever had an epic battle between the flesh and the spirit? Pornography comes up on your screen. Your epic battle between the flesh and the spirit. You go to a party and they're serving drinks and you're trying to get past it, and there's this epic battle between the flesh and the spirit. She says, or he says that. It's that trigger word. It's that trigger story. And there's this epic battle between the flesh and the spirit. You ever had one of those moments, an epic battle between the flesh and the spirit? I have. Still do. When you're trying to be a servant to the undeserving, it can really be difficult. So Jesus is trying to do the will of the Father, but he's got his will, and it's not to go to the cross. Going a little farther, he fell on his face and he prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." His will was not to go to the cross. His Father's will was, and so he does. So he prays 3 times, and he's asking the Father, is there any other way? And the Father says, it must be you, my Son. It must be you. You're the Lamb who's never sinned. You're the Lamb to be sacrificed for my people. Jesus comes back. His disciples are asleep. You know, anybody ever fallen asleep praying? Are you one of those, first thing you do is you pray when you wake up, but you find you fell 30 minutes later, you're waking back up like, I was praying, I fell asleep like with God. You ever had one of those embarrassing moments where you're like just so tired and you're sitting down in front of somebody, maybe it's an interview or a teacher or whatever, that think you fall asleep? And they go, did you just fall asleep? And you go, no, I didn't just fall asleep. Like, I just wonder. So Jesus knows it's time. The hour has come. The hour of darkness has arrived. Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? This big cohort of soldiers arrives, and they ask Jesus if he's Jesus, and he says, I am. They all get knocked down with the sound of his voice because God spoke them loud. He just knocked them all down. Might have been up to 1,000 men. We don't know. It's a bunch of guys and soldiers. They all fall down. And Jesus calls out their cowardly actions. You had to come at night. You couldn't come in the daytime because it would have made all the people mad, and they'd have slaughtered you, but you're coming to slaughter me. This is your hour. And so this evil takes place at night. Often our evil actions are so embarrassing, we want to cover them up. We don't want God or anyone to know about them. We're so embarrassed by them, we don't even talk about them. We're just going to cover them up. Anyway, Rome has come to take a piece of his flesh, and the Jews have too. And so Peter and John, they're following at a distance. The rest of the disciples have run away, but Peter and John, they're so close to Jesus, they don't want to see him go through this trial alone. They're following at a distance, but they can't get too close, because that might mean it cost their lives. And then Jesus will endure court trials and beatings. There are 6 trials of Jesus that take place in 8 hours, approximately 8 hours. 3 Jewish trials find Jesus guilty. 3 Roman trials find him innocent. The beatings and the cruelty would have killed a weaker man. But Jesus completed the walk up Calvary because he's no ordinary man. I'm glad somebody said amen. He is no ordinary man. That long, grueling night of false accusations, cruel beatings, Roman scourgings, that cat o' nine tails, short, durable whip on the hands of a very experienced Roman centurion could rip the flesh off a man, and it did on Jesus. You know, it come around here and pull it off here and expose the insides of the body. He's mutilated, unrecognizable. So much pain. And then he carries the crossbeam as far as he can until he collapses, and Simon of Cyrene is brought into service to carry it the rest of the way. And when they get up to the mountain, that place of the skull, Golgotha, the same place we think Abraham took his son Isaac up, they get up there and they have that cross. And so imagine this rough Roman cross. His body is totally ripped apart, exposed muscles and bones and sinew. He's lost huge amounts of blood. He's been up all night, ridiculed and betrayed by so many people. He's thrown down on the cross. And then those cast nails, those 9-inch nails, are driven through his wrist and his ankles. And then the cross is raised up. There's a big hole in the ground, we think. When the cross goes down in the hole, And then that slow death of asphyxiation begins because you just have to stand up to get a breath, and then you fall back down. You're about to breathe, and it goes on and on. We need a break. There's a timeline here I just wanted to point your attention to. There's about 1,500 years from the time of Moses to Jesus' crucifixion. During that time period, the Lord instituted the sacrificial system where animals would be sacrificed, and thousands upon hundreds of thousands of animals are sacrificed over and over again. And you're like, why? What was God thinking? And here's what He's thinking. Sin always brings death, and blood atones for the sin. He took about 1,500 years so the world would not miss the point. But you already know this, because sin has so messed up your life, you're tired of it. Nobody has to tell you. Sin always causes confusion. Most of the problems we're trying to deal with in life is because of sin. It's messed up everything, right? Anyway, down in the temple, when Jesus is being crucified, most people are unaware of what's going on outside the city, because in the city there's hundreds of thousands of people. And they're doing commerce, and sacrifices are being made, and they're greeting friends, but there's a small band of people up on the hill where the crucifixion is. This isn't an uncommon event. This is a very common event. And they're quite unaware because there's a lot going on in the temple. Inside the temple, all this action is going on. And to the distance, there is a sacrifice being made on a hill. Now, I just want you to imagine the first sacrificial lamb is offered at 9 a.m. in the morning. And there's a sound to get everyone's attention in the city of millions of people. So just close your eyes and try to imagine this. The priest would come out with the lamb and hold it up for everybody in the temple court to see. And then he would set the lamb down and cut its throat. And the priest, on the northern corner of the pinnacle, a place where the shofar was blown, would sound the horn. And complete silence would come over that area as everyone stopped to confess, because they knew what just happened. The shofar points back to that time when Abraham took his son Isaac up on the mountain, and just about where he was ready to drop the knife, God stopped him, and there was a ram caught in the thicket. That's why a ram's horn is used. The shofar, the oldest of all air instruments, was blown when the city of Jericho walls fell down. The shofar was broken to round up the troops to call to war. The shofar was blown right before the battle began to intimidate the enemy. Its curves are said to point to humility of bowing before God. The long blast that begins is about God's faithfulness. The short blasts that follow are about our sinfulness and the brokenness that we experience. The shofar was blown at 9 a.m. Do you know what time Jesus was nailed to the cross? We don't have to guess. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. Everybody's paying attention to the Lamb, but the real Lamb is outside the city. Most people are unaware of that. And so for those first 3 hours, from 9 a.m. to 12 a.m., there's three Jews on a cross. But then something happens that gets everyone's attention. At noon, darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. Imagine the confusion. You're not prepared for night, but night comes in the middle of the day. It was an ominous sign of the sadness of God, of the sin of man, of the darkness that sin brings into our lives. It's a reversal. Do you remember what happened at midnight to shepherds when Jesus was born? Light. And now, dark. You can't make this stuff up. If you don't believe in Jesus, if you don't follow Him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, you're a fool. Because this is the only path forward. This is all we got, man. I'm just saying. And so God reverses the miracle, not light, but now darkness. And then we read, by this time it was noon, and darkness had fallen and fell across the whole land at 3 o'clock. The light from the sun was gone, and suddenly the curtain in the sanctuary, the temple, was torn down the middle, and Jesus shouted, Father, I entrust my spirit into your hands. And with those words, He breathed His last. The second lamb at 3 o'clock was sacrificed. And the priest, in the darkness, blew the shofar one more time. It is finished. Could you imagine the confusion, the darkness? Tombs break open. Prophets of old are walking around resurrected. That'd have been freaky. Right? The thing that gets me, and there's a lot of things that get me about this whole story, but that veil in the temple that separated the Holy of Holies, it was 30 feet wide and 30 feet tall and 3 feet thick. It was quite an apparatus, quite a structure that had to hold that massive veil up. And the moment Jesus breathed His last, the moment the shofar was sounded, when the darkness was covered the land, boom! The veil is split, falls to the ground, and everybody in the temple proper knew what just happened. To the priests, they were blown away. They couldn't imagine. This was an act of God, and they knew it. And now the death of Jesus has accomplished what man and animals never could. The God-man Jesus has made a way to the Father. That's what that symbolizes. That you and I now can go to the Father. We don't need a priest. We are a priesthood, all of us. Right into the Father's presence. In His hour of darkness, Jesus taught us to serve the undeserving and then atone for our sin. This is the message of chapter 26, this hour of darkness. He uses this word, telostatai, which means it is finished, which is an accounting term. It means the account is paid in full. And that all people who put their faith in Jesus need not try to work their way back to God. A way has been made. A way forward has been presented in the upper room to become a servant to all. And so, if you understand what He did on the cross, you can't help but love Jesus. If you ask Him to be your Lord, you will become a slave to others. It's not, do I have to serve? It's like, where do I get to serve? If you don't know Jesus, you need to. We have a warm baptistry, and I'm ready to baptize anyone who will come forward right now who's never been baptized into Christ. If you have faith in Christ, today's the hour of your salvation. Today's the moment. Now look, I hate to be too dramatic, but I got to say, there's another time. The shofar is going to blow. The return of Christ. Paul says, for the Lord Himself will come down of heaven with a commanding shout, and the voice of the archangel, and the trumpet call of God. First, the believers who have died and rise from the graves, then together with them who are still alive and remain on earth will be caught up into the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And then we will be with the Lord forever. So encourage each other with these words. I can't think of more encouraging words. That this is not all there is. That hope is never lost in Jesus. That this is the moment that we can move forward with this great confidence that no matter what we go through in this world, that God's going to redeem it all. And there's going to be this amazing moment where we're caught up with Him. And for all those who refuse to bow the knee to Jesus, they will in that moment. They'll be looking for rocks to get under. And I know this is like, man, this is not the lovey-dovey sermon I wanted my, agnostic friend to hear. I get that. I understand that. But I'm just telling you, life is fragile. And the moments for you to accept Jesus, we think we got a ton of them. We live life like we're bulletproof. We think we've got a million days to make this decision. Today is the day of salvation. I'm standing right here. The baptism's right there. If you're not in Him, why not?
Thank you for joining us. You can find us on the web at cornerstonechatham.org.